Hey, good morning. Today's another one of our first fives. Today, we're in the book of Genesis, chapter 45. And so I'll give you a little bit of background on this story. It's the story of Joseph. And if you don't know the story of Joseph, go back and read a few chapters earlier in Genesis and know the whole story. But the quick summary of the story is this. Joseph was his dad's favorite. That's why as parents, we shouldn't have favorites. And if we do have favorites, we don't want our kids to know about it. And so Joseph's dad had him as his favorite. Well, that led his other brothers, because he had 12 other brothers, and they decided that they didn't like Joseph being around. And so their solution, we're going to sell him into slavery. So Joseph sold into slavery, ends up in Egypt. He finds himself as a servant in Potiphar's house. Then Potiphar's wife really likes Joseph. And so Joseph decides, I don't want to be bad to my master, so I don't really like her. So she accuses him of trying to do something inappropriate. He ends up in prison. He interprets some dreams. He ends up interpreting dreams for Pharaoh. Pharaoh then places him over all of Egypt under him. And he leads him through the time of great produce production and then great famine. And so in the middle of all that, Joseph's brothers need food and they end up in Egypt. And so here's where we pick up the story in Genesis chapter 45. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. They thought he was dead. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will not be plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me. You, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt, and about everything you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly." Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept, and Benjamin embraced him weeping. And he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterward his brothers talked with him. Now, this scene's an incredible picture. It looked like Joseph's life was going one direction, and it was a disaster. It went from being favored son to slave, from leader of a household to prison, from prison to number 2 behind Pharaoh in all of Egypt. See, sometimes God can work through the broken parts of our lives. Now, whether this was God's preordaining as Joseph believes and pushes and believes is what God wanted to do, whether that was the only way God could have fulfilled that, I don't really know. But what I do know is this, that so often in our own lives, God can take those broken pieces of our life, those stories that we think are just full of our shame and our desperation and our fears and our failures. God takes those and he can use them for good. And we can't even see the good often in the moment, but only when we look back over the course of our life can we see God has been at work in our lives. And for some of us, maybe even at the very end of our lives when we look back, that we see the way God was at work in our life, the way he used us when we allowed ourselves to be used by him. But I will say this about Joseph, and he doesn't credit this to himself. He stayed faithful to God. He stayed faithful to following after him in the midst of all these heartaches and all these hardships, and God honored that and blessed him. And so maybe for you and I, God wants to bless us in unique ways. Now, we probably won't be number 2 in command, but maybe we'll find God's blessing pour out over our families, over generations to come. Maybe the faith that we can live out, maybe our kids and grandkids will see it, and it will change the legacy we leave behind so that the next generation might know. And maybe they'll grow even deeper in their faith because of what you and I do now. So here's the good news for you and I today. Our past can be our past, and God can weave his great work into our lives if we'll allow him. And so my prayer for you and I today is that you and I will be the people who allow God to change us and shape us and mold us so we become more like him. We'll catch you next time for another First Five.